integrating with ChatGPT API by creating your own chat application. Hey everyone, this is KeyStrokes. I'm a senior software engineer at one of the FANGs, and I like to make videos on anything and everything about computer science. And today we'll take a look at ChatGPT API, which was recently released by OpenAI, and we'll create our own chat application by integrating with the ChatGPT API. I'm pretty sure everybody knows what ChatGPT is by now, and I think a lot of us developers have been waiting for the APIs to be out so that we can integrate it into our own applications. And OpenAI finally released the APIs on March 1st, 2023, and they released APIs for which is the chat completion that we all know and have played around with, as well as Whisper API, which is speech to text API. And looks like there are many companies that have already onboarded onto the ChatGPT API, like Snapchat, who introduced My AI for Snapchat Plus. Then we have Quizlet, who has been working with OpenAI for the last few years, and now they're using GPT-3 across many of their use cases, and they have introduced something called as QChat, which is a fully adaptive AI tutor, which sounds very intriguing. And Instacart has integrated with ChatGPT alongside their own AI, and that's going to help customers to find ideas for shopping goals. And Shopify's Shop app has introduced a new shopping assistant which can make personalized recommendations based on what you're searching. And then there is Speak, which I haven't used, but looks like they are using Whisper API to improve their app. So those were some of the cool uses of ChatGPT, and maybe now it's your turn to integrate this into your own app as well. Well, then let's do it. We'll first start by giving an overview of the ChatGPT API and everything that you need to know on how to use it. And then we'll build our own chat application and integrate the ChatGPT API into it. If you had to make a curl API call to the ChatGPT API, then this is how an API request might look like. And don't worry, we won't be using the curl API in our development, rather we'll be using a library, but this helps outline everything that's involved in an API call to ChatGPT API. The first thing that you'll notice is the API key. You can sign up on OpenAI and get your own API key, and make sure you keep it private, because if your API key gets leaked, then anybody can use it. Then the next important part is the model. Here you specify what ChatGPT model you want to use. OpenAI recommends using GPT 3.5 Turbo, as this will be updated to the latest stable model every time. Then let's get into some more nitty-gritty details here, like what are roles? There are three kinds of roles. The first one is a system role. This basically sets the behavior of the assistant. That is, we sort of give a persona to the assistant. Then the other role is the user role, and these are the messages that are basically sent by the user. And then we have the assistant role, which are basically the replies by ChatGPT itself or any responses that you expect that the assistant should give you. Okay, now let's look into what are messages. On your screen you can see there are a bunch of messages, and that's what the API call expects. The first message that you'll always have is the system message. This will basically establish the behavior of ChatGPT. So in the message, you set the role as system and you give it a content. For example, here we say that ChatGPT is a helpful assistant. So any responses that the model will generate will take this behavior into consideration. After that, we give it a list of message history. So let's say you have been talking to ChatGPT for quite some time. So in the subsequent API calls, you need to provide a message history to it, which serves as the context, telling it everything that you have discussed with the API so far. These usually involve user and assistant messages, which are alternating. Like the user speaks something, the assistant replies back, which is ChatGPT in this case, and it's just back and forth conversation that we provide to the API. And then the last message is the new user message, for which we'll expect a response from the model. So in this case, we started by establishing the context that ChatGPT is a helpful assistant. And then we gave it a history of what we have talked so far. In this case, we asked who won the World Series in 2020, and ChatGPT says the Los Angeles Dodgers won the World Series in 2020. I haven't fact checked that, so if that's wrong, let me know in the comments. And then continuing on, there might have been more messages between the user and the assistant, and then the user basically asks, well, tell me more. And that's all what there is on how to use the ChatGPT API. Next, let's talk about the costs, as it's not as intuitive as you'd think. The API calls are charged at $0.002 for every 1,000 tokens. But what is a token? In the ChatGPT documentation, they mention that a token for English language could be as short as a character or as long as one whole word, and it could vary across different languages. And let's take an example to understand this better. Let's say the phrase is ChatGPT is great. The documentation mentions that there are 6 tokens in here. The first token is chat, the second token is G, the third token is PT, then we have is, and then we have great, and then the exclamation mark. Now I know it doesn't make sense on how it figured out what's a token and how it broke it down into 6 components here, but they recommend using the library called TickToken, and they have a whole guide on how to count tokens using their library. I'll post a link for all of these in the description. Well, that was all the boring yet essential things that we had to know about the ChatGPT API, and now we can build our chat application. But before that, please don't forget to subscribe to my channel and to like this video if you have been liking my explanation so far. And you can also show me your support by buying me some coffee at this link. Also, if you'd like to have one-on-ones with me, you can use the Google form that I've put in the description of the video to get in touch with me. I can help you learn on how to code, prepare for interviews, consult on project ideas and its execution, and honestly anything and everything about computer science. Well, let's jump into our IDE and build our chat application. Okay, so let's begin. Here I have VS Code and I've created a new directory called ChatGPT, and I'll be recording the commands that I run in this commands.sh file. So let's start by setting up a new NextJS project, and for that we'll run this command. So let me copy this and run it in the terminal. You can give the project name as ChatGPT API Chat, and yes, we'll use ESLint. We'll keep the source directory. We don't need anything experimental as such, and this is the import alias we'll use, and let's wait for it to be ready. Okay, so we have our project created right here, and now the next thing we'll do is install some dependencies, and we'll be installing 3 dependencies. The first 2 dependencies here are the chat libraries. I looked into multiple chat libraries and this one turned out to be the best. And then we'll install OpenAI to interact with ChatGPT. So let's run these commands. Before I run this, let me get into the project, which is ChatGPT API Chat. And now let's run this command to install our dependencies. Also, one last thing that we'll do is create a .env file here. So we'll do new file and name it .env. And in here, we'll put our OpenAI API key that we'll use to interact with ChatGPT. And you can create this API key on the OpenAI website. And please remember that this API key should be kept private, and whatever we are doing right now is only for demonstration. Ideally, you will put all of this on a server and expose this through your own API. Anyhow, here's the API key that I'll be using. I'm going to invalidate this after the video, so please don't try to use this, it won't work. So that's all that we needed to set up our package, dependencies, and the env file. Next, we'll be running this command, npm run dev, which will start our server and launch our web app. So running npm run dev, and we can see that the server started on port 3000. So let's go into our browser, and here I have localhost. Let me refresh this, and we have Next.js set up. Now let's create a different page for our chat application. So going back to our IDE, let's expand source, pages, and in here we'll create a new file. Let's call it chat.tsx. And let's create a functional component here to export default function. Let's call it chat. And in here, we can just return a div which says hello world. Let's save this, go back to our browser and try to go to that location. It should be available at /chat. And yes, we can see, we see hello world right here. So let's see how we want to organize our components here. So we'll have a div here, which will be our container. And then I want another div in here. This is where we'll set our behavior, and then we'll have another div where we'll have our chat component hosted. So let's first start by creating our chat component. The chatscope documentation mentioned to apply their styles, which we can put in the app.tsx file. This just applies the default chat CSS. So this is something that we had to do in app.tsx. And now here we can put in main container first, which is the main container of our chat. We can see it got imported on the top. Let me shrink this terminal further down. And then we'll have a chat container. And inside the chat container, we'll have a list of messages, which is called message list. Now, other than the message list, we need a message input. And let me close this. Well, let's see how this looks in our browser right now. Let's refresh this. And yeah, we see something. We can see this is a chat input here. And if I put something, nothing really happens. Okay, so let's continue building our chat application. The first thing I'll do is create styles in here. So let's create a new file. Let's call it chat.module.css. And the first style that I'll put is the container, which will have a display of flex. then flex direction as columns, as we want to stack a few things. Then we'll give it a padding of, let's say, 6 rem, give it a height of 100 view height, a width of 100 view width, and a background color of, let's say, all zeros, and then some text color as all white, FFFFF, and we'll use this in our chat.tsx. So in here, we can do class name as styles.container, but first we should import our styles in here. So we can do import styles from add styles and then chat.module.css. Okay, let's save this and see if something improves in our browser. Yeah, we can see we have some padding, but the chat window still doesn't have good enough height here. So let's fix that first. To do that, let's have another class. Let's call it class name, and we can do styles.chat wrapper, let's say. And let's define the CSS in our chat module. We can do chat wrapper, and we can do display as flex. We can do flex direction as row, and give it a height of, let's say, 100%. Let's go back into our browser and see if it looks any better. Okay, something happened, but now it's missing the complete width here. I think we can fix that by introducing another wrapper. Let's call it chat container, width as 100%, min height as 50 view height. That's the minimum height that we want for our chat, and a max height of, let's say, 80 view height. Let's take this and we'll put this in our chat.tsx. Let's create another div, and we can do class name as styles.chatContainer, and we can move our whole chat stuff in here. Let's indent this right and save this. Okay, let's go back to our browser and hopefully something is better. Yep, now this looks so much better. We have our chat input here and the chat window up top. I'm not an expert with CSS, so if you think there's a better way to do this, please let me know in the comments. Okay, now the next thing that we'll create is a state that will hold our messages. So we can do const messages and set messages, and we'll do use state, which will take an array, and let's give it a type, which will be an array of messages. Let's define this message type, which will be type message, and we'll have content, which will be the string. Then we'll have a time when the message was sent, who the sender was, and then this property is a chatscope property where it wants to know the direction, whether it was an incoming message or an outgoing message. Now in our messages list, we can iterate on the messages that we created. So we can do messages.map, and we'll take this one message, and then we'll return a type of message, which is from chatscope again. Share some indentation, and we don't really need another tag to close. And let's import this in from the chatscope. And in here, we need to provide a model, which will basically be the message, which is the content that we store in our message object here. Then we have the send time, which will again be read from our message.sendTime. This should be a string. Then we have a sender, which is message.sender. Then we have the direction, which is message.direction. And there are two more fields, which are position and the kind of message this is. We're only dealing with text messages, so I'll leave it as text. You can read more about all of these properties in the chatscope documentation. The documentation is pretty thorough, so you can modify this however you'd like. But I'm trying to keep the example as simple as possible. Next, let's update our message input so that the messages actually get appended to our messages variable that we have, or the state that we have, and then we can see these messages. So let's give it a placeholder first that says type message here, and then we can add what happens when we send the message. We'll create a function, let's call it send message, and let's add a few more properties like autofocus as true, and then let's remove the attach button because there was an attachment button on the input form that we don't really need, so making this a false. Let's create this send message function. Okay, so creating this function here, let's do const send message, and I think the signature of it gives us a bunch of things. Oops. So looking at the on send, yeah, it gives a bunch of stuff. So I'll just copy this and let's put this in our signature. Now, all we need to do here is update our messages that we have. Actually, this should be inside our component. So these messages need to be updated. So we can simply do set messages and then deconstruct the messages that we have already so that the state gets updated. And then in here, we'll push our new message as well. So let's first create our new message. So new message will be the content as the text content, and this new message should follow this message type. So we have content, then we have send time. We can simply do math.floor of date.now by 1000. Then we have sender, because you are sending this message, it will be you. And then direction will be outgoing in this case because you're sending the message. And then let's also do this. Let's do new message list, which will be a deconstructed array of our existing messages. And we'll just push this new message in there. So we just do a push of the new message into this new message list. And then we can simply set messages as this new message that we have. Okay, so let's see if this works. Going back to our browser, let's send a message. Let's say hello. And we can see that the messages are being appended here. So hello, what's up, keystrokes. And yeah, so this messages list is working fine. Now, when we send a message, we should now call the ChatGPT API to respond to our message. So before we create the ChatGPT integration, I'd like to create a dummy integration by just simulating the API call. So for that, let's create a new function called getResponse. And let's make it an async method. And all we'll do here is wait for, let's say, 1 second, and we can do set timeout fs 1000, and then in the end we can just return content, which will be our message as math.random. So let's call this getResponse from our send message. Let's do getResponse, and we can store this in a response variable. And similar to this new message object that we created, we'll create a similar message here, new message response. And in here, response will be response.content. And looks like it's complaining that it shouldn't be a number. So let's update it here. Let's make it like this. Okay. Then the send time is fine. The sender will be ChatGPT. Let's create a constant called ChatGPT user. And then this message will be incoming because we are receiving it from ChatGPT. So incoming. So let's update this ChatGPT and create a constant up here. So const ChatGPT is equal to ChatGPT. And let's see if this works now. So going to our browser again, it's complaining that await isn't allowed in a non-async function. I think I missed putting await in send message here. Yep. So here we need async, and this should be good now. So going back to our browser, and let's try this now. Hello, and we still don't have a response. I guess I missed something else. Oh yeah, we have new message response, but we don't do anything with it. So we'll do something similar, or we'll do exactly similar here. We'll push this message into our new message list, and we'll update our messages state to use this new messages list with the response. So going back to our browser again, and let's say hello again. And after a second, we got a very nice math response. Very machine-like, and we can keep doing it. What's up? How are you? And it just responds after 1 second. That's good. So let's just refine this a little more. Let's create a state here where we say if you're waiting for a response. So waiting for response, set waiting for response equal to use state, and by default we'll initialize it as false. And then before we make our API call, which is getResponse here, we'll set waiting for response as true. And once our message is appended, we'll set it to false. And we can use this waiting for response in our message input so that it gets disabled if you're waiting for a response. So I think there's a disabled property, and we can set as waiting for response. Okay, so let's try this again. Now when I say hello, I'm expecting this to be disabled until we have a response. Yep, now it is disabled, and now it's enabled again. World. Now there's one last thing we need to do. If you see it doesn't autofocus, I have to click in here every time. So let's fix that really quick. These are small things, but that makes the application much better. So to do that, we'll create a ref to this message input that we have. Let's call it message input, and let's create a ref on top here. We can do const message input equal to use ref, and we can assign it as null. And by default, let me first import useRef, and the type for this should be HTML div element. And then we'll add a simple use effect here, which will monitor the waiting for response state. And let's import use effect first. And if the waiting for response is false, then we'll just do message input dot current, and we'll focus on it. So this is all React stuff, not related to ChatGPT. We're just creating a nice scaffolding that we can use to integrate with the API. Well, let's try to use our app again. Now here when I say hello, it should give us a random number after a second, and then our input should be focused again. So hello, and then yes, we have focus again. I didn't have to click in there, world, and yes, now it's auto-focusing. Okay, this is good. Now the next thing that we need to declare is the default behavior that we want to use with our ChatGPT. If you remember, the first message to ChatGPT should be the behavior that we want to use. So let's declare a default behavior and we'll call it general conversation. I just couldn't come up with anything better, so I just used general conversation as the behavior for the assistant. Now I would like to make this as an input. So scrolling down here in this div here, we can make it an input whose value will be behavior input, which is a state that we'll create. And on change, this will just update our behavior input. So which can be done by set behavior input to e.target.value. And then we'll create a button here as well, which we'll click on to set the behavior. And we can do on click will be update behavior, and we can say update behavior as the text. And now we need to create these three things. So let's start by creating behavior first. So scrolling up to all of our states, we can do const. We have set behavior, and this could be use state, and by default we'll give it the value of default behavior. Next, let's create the function that we have for update behavior. Let's call it const update behavior and a new method. And in here, we want to set the correct behavior. But here we also need to check in case you provide an empty behavior, we want to use the default behavior for it. So maybe we can do something like const final behavior equal to whatever our behavior input was. We'll trim it in case it's all empty. And if its length is 0, then we'll just give the default behavior. Otherwise, we'll just use behavior input dot trim. And then we can set our behavior, which will be another state that will create to this final behavior, and not input, just set behavior. So let's create this new state up here, which will be very similar to this. So we have set behavior, and by default, we'll leave it as the default behavior. Okay, let's see how things look like in our browser. You can see we have general conversation and we can update our behavior here. So let me add some CSS here so this looks a bit more bearable. So give me a few seconds. Okay, so this looks much better, and that's the best I could get with my CSS skills for now. The improvements will be never ending otherwise. Let's make sure this still works. So let me send hello here and we get a reply back as a number. And yes, this works fine. So going back to our IDE, let's do the fun part of integrating with the ChatGPT API now. So the first thing we'll do is initialize our client, which we can do on the top here. So over here, let's create another constant. Let's call it configuration. And this will be a new ChatGPT configuration, which you can import from OpenAI. And to this, we pass the API key that we have. So API key will be process.env, and then the API key that we defined here in our .env file. So copying this and pasting it right here. Next, we'll create our OpenAI client, and we can do new OpenAI API and pass in the configuration that we just created. Let's call it OpenAI client. Okay, so now we'll use this to make our API call. Now scrolling down to where we had our dummy behavior of returning a math statement. Here, the first thing that we'll create is our system message. Let's call it system message, which will have a role as system, and we can import that from chat completion request message role enum, and we'll use system as the role. And then we'll provide the content as the behavior that we set. So this will be our first message. So if you remember, we need our system message, then the history of messages, and then the new message that we'll be sending. Now where we call get response up here, we can see we already have the history of our message here in this messages list, and we append the new message here as well. So we should pass this message list when we call get response. So going back to get response, let's take this as the input, which will be a list of messages. And in here, let's run a map on this. So map, we get message, and then here we can return the role and we'll return the content. So the content is easy, that's message.content. And as for the role, we need to check who the sender was. So if the message.sender is ChatGPT, which was the constant that we defined, then this should be the assistant, which we can pick from this enum here. So we can do .assistant. Otherwise, this will be user. So let's store this as our input. So now we have our system message, we have our input, which contains the history of messages and the new messages. And now all we need to do is use our OpenAI client and call the API. And we'll call create chat completion. And to this, we'll pass a bunch of parameters. The first parameter is the model, which will be GPT 3.5 Turbo. And then we'll pass a list of messages, which will be a system message first. So it is system message that we created, and then this input that we created. So deconstructing this, and this should give us our response. Now, as part of the response, we need to return it in the form of this content here. So we can do return response.data, or we should add an await here as well. So we don't need await here, but yeah, going back. So we need response.data, and then it gives you multiple choices. We'll just pick the first choice. And then if there's a message in there, we take that and then we return the content from it. And I'll also log this just so that we can see how it looks like. Okay, so let's give this a shot. Going back to our browser, let me open the inspector so we can look at our console, and I'll refresh this whole thing so we can clear our state. Well, now let's send a message. Hello. And this is the response from ChatGPT that says, hello there, how are you doing? I am doing well. How about you? And this is the response from ChatGPT. That looks pretty cool. And here we can see how the response looks like. Let me zoom this a little. We can see it returns data with some choices. And then here we have a message which has the content, and then assistant as the role. Now I want to add just one last tweak where we can see that ChatGPT is typing here. For that, let me go back to the IDE and let me get rid of these comments, and scrolling down in the message list, we can add a typing indicator, which will use waiting for response state that we have. And if we are waiting for a response, we'll use the typing indicator component, and we'll simply say ChatGPT is thinking. Closing it, and let's give it a style as well. Let's say a background of the same background we have been using everywhere, which is 32A74. I want to give this background to the text input that we have here as well. And well, let's go back to our browser and see if it works. Yeah, this looks much better. I'm going to shut this console and let's send another message. Nothing much. What about you? And now we can see it says ChatGPT is thinking, and we get a very nice response. Well, let's try to change this behavior. And before we do that, let me just refresh so we start with a whole new context. So let's say the behavior is you are a lawyer, and we update the behavior. And now let's send a message. Just say hello, and we get a response. How can the assistant assist with our legal needs? Because now we change the behavior of our AI. Let's try something more fun. Let me refresh. And now we can say you are a coding expert, and let's update the behavior. How well do you code? Well, very programmatic answer. So I'm really not sure how well the behavior works, but I'm sure there's some impact of it. Let's refresh this again. I think I should add a button where we can clear all the history. Well, let's try to say that you are a helpful assistant, which we saw in the video. We updated the behavior, and now let's ask some questions. Hello, can you help me with the ChatGPT API today? How do I use it? That's a very detailed answer, but I think my video conveyed this information much better. But that's very interesting that they have all of these endpoints, like to understand the emotion of the text, to figure out the personality from the traits of a given text. Those are very interesting. Okay, thank you for the help. You have a great day. So that's all I had for this integration. We created a very simple chat application where we integrated with ChatGPT, where we send a message and ChatGPT responds back through the APIs. I'm hoping that in the future, OpenAI will let us customize the model for the ChatGPT so that the answers that we get is more in the scope of the business rather than a very generic API responses. So that's all I had for this video. I hope you had a fun time integrating with the ChatGPT API and build a very similar chat application that we see on the OpenAI website. If this video was helpful, please don't forget to subscribe to my channel and to like this video and to follow me on Twitter and show me your support by buying me some coffee. And please feel free to reach out to me if you're interested in one-on-ones with me. I'm working on the next video, and you have any suggestions, please post them in the comments. Otherwise, check out this video on your screen. You might like it. See you next time.